Hi, it's Mr. Ramage, and this video lesson is going to take a quick look at the beginning of the labor movement in the United States during America's Industrial Revolution. For the purpose of this lesson, I'm going to be utilizing this standard here, which says the rise of industrialization led to a rapidly expanding workforce. Labor organizations grew amidst unregulated working conditions, laissez-faire policies toward big business, and violence toward supporters of organized labor. So there's 3 or 4 major topics that we want to discuss in this lesson. And we're going to start with that first one in the standard, these unregulated working conditions. So what exactly does that mean? What that means basically is businesses operated without any kind of oversight or government regulation. Basically, there are no laws really controlling business. And this comes from the philosophies of Adam Smith in the book Wealth of Nations and his concept of free market capitalism. And that laissez-faire policies towards big business would allow it to grow quickly and to develop quickly and to produce goods, produce wealth, produce products, right? And that the government would have no real interference, that the government would be hands-off. It would allow business to do the things that made business successful. And that's great, but unfortunately, what we're going to see under this free market capitalist system is, yes, amazing amounts of productivity and amazing wealth being generated, but at the cost of some pretty terrible working conditions for the people who labor in these factories and mines and in these companies, right? So again, very briefly, under a free market capitalist system, we have an individual who owns the factors of production, the entrepreneur who raises the capital, who makes the time and the investments, who owns the factory and hires the workers and sells the products, and then earns the vast majority of the profits from that. Whereas the worker receives a very small percentage in the form of very small wages. So because of this sort of embrace that the United States has for, this free market capitalist system, industrial workers are going to be facing many conditions that are not very good. So again, the long hours of workers from 12 to 13 to 14-hour days, the low wages, the dangerous and unsafe conditions, the unhealthy conditions of many places where they worked, and the frequent mistreatment by the ownership towards those workers. These are all things that your average worker in late 1800s America is facing pretty much everywhere. So there's not really a lot of good things happening, especially for working class Americans. These are pretty commonplace in the United States. In 1890, the poverty line in the United States was about $500 a year, and 55% of the American workforce was earning less than poverty wages. By 1900, the average salary is a little bit better, $675 a year, but your average work week was about 59 hours a week, and those wages worked out to be just around $13 a week. So again, lots of hours, not very many wages. So will owners improve these conditions? Because obviously this is not really sustainable. Will the owners make these conditions any better? Well, probably not, right? So in a world without regulations, the factory owners are motivated by profits, so they are motivated to work their workers as many hours as they can. They are motivated by profit to keep wages as low as possible, to not make investments in safety products because that would cost money. So for the owner, paying higher wages and improving these conditions and providing any types of benefits would lower their profits, and that's not something they want to see happen. So on the left side, we see huge amount of profits under this world of laissez-faire capitalism without regulation or control. On the right-hand side, those profits are going to get smaller. Maybe not that small, but they're going to be reduced, and that's not something the owners are interested in. So if the owners aren't going to improve the conditions for the workers, what about the government? Will the government improve these conditions? Well, no, the government is going to side with business. So we've got the idea that, hey, this is not good. Regulation is bad for business. Adam Smith told us that if the government gets involved, that's actually counterproductive. We want a productive and prosperous economy, and it's not the government's job to get involved in the economy, and regulations will slow our growth. And on the other hand, these owners are very wealthy, very powerful, and very influential, and the government needs them on their side. And then, of course, we've got the accusations of socialism. If the government's getting involved, that sounds like socialism, and that's a dirty word, and we don't want that here, right? And again, we're not going to do a super deep dive into socialism. We're just going to kind of look at this idea that it's a system, an economic and political system, where the government owns the factors of production. So we remove, right, the entrepreneur, we remove the owner from the scenario, and the government makes the big decisions. The government runs the big industries in the country, and they make the decisions not necessarily based on profits, but they make the decisions based on how will this benefit the most amount of people. The idea is to maybe more equally redistribute the wealth generated by the economy, which would maybe reduce the profits and spread those profits out amongst the workers who produce those goods. Again, you can deep dive socialism and learn a lot more about it, but just kind of need to know a basic understanding of it for this lesson. So again, why are we opposed to this? This is not what the American system is kind of built for. The American system celebrates individualism and freedom of choice. That goes for your business owners, right? Even for the employees, right? They choose to work in these places. They can work hard and make more money. So the American system is kind of built on this idea of capitalism. It's pretty much ingrained into how people perceive things in America, and changing that system is not exactly what people are looking for in the late 1800s. So the government is most certainly not going to really embrace a lot of regulatory actions. So how are these conditions going to improve? How are they going to get better? Well, it's not something the owners are going to necessarily do. It's not something the government is necessarily do. So it falls to the workers themselves to make improvements, and that's where we get our unions from. Unions are when workers organize to negotiate better conditions, and that's called collective bargaining. So collective bargaining is when labor and ownership sits down together to negotiate the terms of their employment, to negotiate wages and hours and conditions and things like that. We're just looking at a very basic description of this. So what's in it for the worker? Well, of course, the workers are interested in making these conditions better. So joining a union would hopefully get this worker his 8-hour workday, maybe some better wages and safer conditions, an end to child labor, which is something that is also driving wages down. As long as you have all these child workers, we're really not going to see a raise in wages, and maybe some benefits, maybe some time off or some sort of, whatever, right? Some kind of benefit to working for this company. So these are sort of the basic things that a union would be looking for in the late 1800s. Well, what power do the unions have? Well, there's obviously power in numbers. The more people that are united together, the more power that block of people have. An individual can be easily dismissed. It's a lot harder to get rid of a large group of people. But one of the biggest weapons that a union has, of course, is the strike. Strike is a work stoppage designed to hurt the owner, hurt management, stop production of a good, and sort of show the owner, hey, you pretty much need us to produce these goods. Now, threatening a strike may motivate the owner to negotiate, or it could, be kind of catastrophic. Joining a union and going on strike was extremely risky, especially for the workers, because there is no guarantee that if you strike, you're ever going to get your job back or win those things that you're striking for. And of course, owners do not like unions whatsoever, and they are going to do lots of things to get rid of those unions. Many companies are going to institute contracts or oaths that are going to force workers to sign when they get hired that promise that they're not going to join a union. Factories will do lockouts, which is kind of a reverse strike, which locks the employees outside of the factory and prevents them from coming into work and forming the union. Blacklists were very common, where the names of union supporters and union organizers were listed and shared amongst factory owners in certain areas. And then strike breakers, people who were come in to replace the workers, like scabs, or physically come and break up a strike by beating up and attacking the striking union members. So owners are going to do a lot of things to try to prevent unions in their factories. They're a threat to the owners, and they are going to do whatever they can to try to block the formation of those unions. So if unions are forming and unions are striking, where does the government fall on this? Well, I don't think you're going to be too surprised to learn that the government's not going to really support labor unions at all. Of course, they're going to take the side of ownership. And again, this all goes into this laissez-faire capitalist model that we have in the United States, especially at the end of the 1800s, that strikes were un-American. It was a conspiracy to harm our business, and the government's going to obviously side with ownership. So the workers, they're not really trying to overthrow the country. They're just trying to have a better life and feed their families, and it is a big, big struggle. Other reasons why people may have been anti-union, well, in some previous lessons, we've talked about our attitudes towards immigrants in the late 1800s. A lot of union members are immigrants or second-generation Americans, so we're going to associate unions with immigrants, and since we don't really like immigrants very much, that's going to be passed off to not liking the unions. Now, some union members were more radical than others. Some of them did believe in more radical and extreme ideas like Marxism or anarchism. So yes, there are those people out there, but they're definitely in the minority. That unions were seen as a threat to America. To support a union was to be anti-American, that it was attacking our capitalist system, it was attacking our democracy, it was going to take away people's freedoms. So again, there's all of these sort of perceptions of what a union is. Strikes were also disruptive. Large strikes that involved the railroad or coal transportation or steel manufacturing could be extremely disruptive and inconvenient to the country. And oftentimes, as we'll touch on here in a moment, strikes became very violent. So the idea of violence is associated with those unions. Now, the unions themselves don't all share the same ideologies, and not all of them actually admit similar workers. So even amongst the unions, there's a lot of disagreements and disunity. So there's all sorts of different unions that are going to pop up. Some of them aren't going to admit unskilled workers. Some of them are not going to admit immigrants and only take native-born Americans. Some of them are not going to allow African Americans or women to join. So amongst the unions themselves, you have a wide variety of different types of unions. Some are going to be relatively peaceful and non-violent, while others are going to be more radical and more violent. So here are some images of some labor unions and some people on strike or picketing. Women were relatively underrepresented in many unions, which allowed them to go off and form their own unions to address the needs of women. So again, labor unions aren't as super inclusive at this time, and there's going to be lots of issues amongst the unions in terms of who we're going to admit. African Americans are kept out of many unions, as well as women and other immigrant groups. Again, we have unions that are violent. We can see these gentlemen here armed with rifles and pistols. Okay, so again, things are going to get pretty challenging. Here are just a few of the more famous and large violent strikes that break out in the United States. Feel free to look these up on your own. I'm just going to touch on them very briefly. In 1877, the Great Railroad Strike, which President Rutherford B. Hayes declares a state of insurrection over. 2/3 of the nation's railroads are shut down. By the time it's all over, there's 100 people dead and $10 million in damage. Probably the most famous is in 1886, the Haymarket Riot in Chicago. That is usually one that pops up on state assessments. So if you're a student, you definitely want to make sure you're familiar with Haymarket. Also another big one in 1892, the Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania involving Carnegie Steel, as well as the Pinkertons. Again, the government getting involved in almost each and every one of these on the side of the workers, not on the side of the strikers. In 1894, the Pullman Strike. involving the American Railway Union. Again, the president getting involved, President Cleveland this time sending federal troops in to Illinois to put down the strike. And we have people dying in these strikes, lots of people dying in these strikes, and that's not okay. We're going to start to wrap up the lesson by looking at just a couple of some of the larger labor unions that were formed during this time. One of the largest was the Knights of Labor, founded in 1869 by Uriah Smith. Their goal was to unite workers into this one big brotherhood and to advocate for better working conditions and, of course, social reforms. This was an inclusive union, which allowed people to join regardless of their race or gender or skill level. By 1896, it grew to about 1 million people, but lost support after the Haymarket Square riot in 1896. And we have the American Federation of Labor, formed in 1886 by Samuel Gompers. Now, this labor union only attracted and only allowed skilled workers to join, and supported a process called closed shops, where businesses would only hire union members. That is actually going to be outlawed in 1947. You can't do that anymore. This union becomes pretty prominent in the United States. By 1920, they actually allowed African American workers, so it does make some inclusivity by 1920. One of the larger, more radical unions will be the International Workers of the World, which was formed in 1905, including mostly immigrant workers and unskilled workers. This union proves to be a bit too militant and too revolutionary to gain a lot of support in the United States, and definitely had some members who were more than willing to take some more aggressive actions in their form of protest. So, let's step back and look at some key takeaways and what we should probably know concerning the content presented in this lesson. So, number one, workers in many industries face similar challenges. Wages were bad, hours were bad, conditions were bad. I always tell my students that's kind of the holy trinity of labor unions, right? Better wages, better hours, better conditions. Unions were formed in order for workers to win those through hopefully collective bargaining, where a union could negotiate with ownership to try to get better conditions for the workers. Unions could resort to striking or work stoppage to force those owners to meet their demands, but striking was very risky, as it didn't guarantee that you would be able to keep your job or have one after the strike was over. Owners used a number of tactics to stop unions from forming, like contracts, oaths, lockouts, strike breakers, and blacklists. Unions were seen as un-American and not supported by the government or the general public. Large, violent, disruptive strikes made unions unpopular and did not help their cause because it left a bad impression on the American public. The government typically took the side of business owners and helped to suppress unions and strikers by sending in state militias, state national guards, federal troops to put down these supposed insurrections by the workers. And unions like the Knights of Labor, the AFL, and the IWW appealed to different types of workers, and they used different tactics to try to win their rights. And historically, unions are not going to become very effective until around the 1940s. So the story of labor unions is a very long one, and it's going to take a very long time for American workers to really see significant changes in their working conditions. Thanks for watching this video lesson, and I hope you learned something.